myself to push and never stop. I've been stressed out.
It's cold.
These hands around the clock with my eyes wide, trying to get the panorama shot. Whole world getting blurry to me. Answers getting
How's it going, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to the channel. I'm David Clark. This is my old sled, and today we're going to change a snowmobile track. We're going to drive this sled over to my buddy's shop. We're going to remove the piece of track that it came with, and we're going to reinstall a brand new T32 from Composit Snowmobile Tracks. If you're a little intimidated by the idea of changing a track, I don't blame you. It is a bigger job, but if you can use a set of sockets and you got a decent place to work, you can do this. I believe in you. So this is a bigger job. I got a fair bit to cover. It'll probably be a little bit longer video, but I'll try and keep it interesting for you, so get comfortable and hang out with me for a bit. All right, guys, it's the big day. I am going to do the track change on this 2005 MXZ or MXZ 600. So regardless of the sled that you have, in order to get the old track out and the new one in, you're going to have to do two things. You're going to have to remove your rear skid or the rear suspension. And the other thing we're going to have to do is get the drive axle out of there. My one piece of advice is this is a job you definitely want a decent place to work. So I'm over at my friend's shop. He's nice enough to let me work here and give me a bit of a hand. It's also a job where there's a number of smaller or sub jobs involved in the overall job. So for example, we're taking the chain case apart. So you're going to need chain case oil and brake cleaner because you want to clean that chain case while you're at it. We're taking the rear skid out, so it's a great time to change the sliders. It's so much easier to do when the skid's out of the machine. I did this job by lifting the rear end of the machine in the air while I worked. A couple of guys suggested flipping the machine on its side. Now, I think that would have probably been easier in retrospect. Now, having it in the air, you've got access to your secondary clutch and your chain case, which is nice. So you'd have to flip it back and forth doing it the other way. But if the machine was on its side, I can tell you it would have been a lot easier to manhandle that rear skid and drive axle back in. Okay, we're also going to have to tighten and align the track once we get the rear skid back in. So it's a good idea to look that procedure up online before you start, and you might want to have a track tensioning tool. So the first thing I did was remove the exhaust. It's just going to be a lot more room, especially when you get the muffler out of the way to get at the battery compartment and the chain case. In order to remove the muffler on an SDI model, you're going to have to remove the exhaust gas temperature sensor first. I'm going to start on the chain case side. Now, in order to get the chain case cover off, I'm going to have to get this battery box out of the way. There's four bolts altogether. There's two that go into the tunnel, and then there's another two bigger bolts that go into the chain case. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is pull the chain case cover off. This machine, again, it has electronic reverse. So to reverse this sled, you press the starter. It shuts the motor down and retimes it, so it's running in reverse. So that means there's no reverse gears in the chain case, so this one is really straightforward. There's a top and a bottom gear. So one thing with this sled from a maintenance perspective, I don't think the previous owner did regular chain case oil change on it. The oil in it was really, really thick. It was like chocolate pudding. It was pretty disgusting. All right, we'll just begin by loosening off that chain so we can get it out and get the lower gear out. So obviously, guys, pay really careful attention to how the parts are when you take it apart so you know how it goes back together. When you can, put a bolt back in the hole that you took it out of so it's still there when you go back to work. And once we've got that lower gear off, you can see the bearing here for the drive axle. So there is a little circlet or a snap ring in here. So you're going to need a snap ring tool to remove that. Once that snap ring is out, then that bearing is free, and the drive axle will move to the right of the machine when we take it out. So now we can go over and work on the other side. Okay. With the drive belt removed, we can go ahead and take our secondary clutch off. Just make note of any shims that might be in behind it. The last step in removing the drive axle is removing this cover for the speedometer sensor, but I'm going to hold here, and now I'm going to go and remove the rear skid. So we're going to start off by loosening the rear axle bolts. So we're going to back these adjusters off all the way, and that'll give us room to get that rear skid out. Some of these have a locking nut, these don't. So once we've got the track loosened right off, we can go ahead and remove the four bolts that hold the skid in, and we're going to start at the back. Now, if it was on its side, it would have been easy to take these bolts out, but with the machine up in the air like this, once I remove the rear bolts, I'm going to get my friend to lower that skid to the ground. And so now the last thing we're going to do is just manhandle that drive axle out so we can pull the track right out. All right, so we've got a snap ring holding the bearing on each end of the drive axle. We remove that and the axle is free. There we go. Okay. Now I'm going to slide that bearing off. Okay. Yeah, now it should be able to go your way.
The whole thing should come out. There it is. There we go. So just cut this.
And with that drive axle out of the way, you can go ahead and pull that old track out of there. The other job I did was I replaced the sliders because it's super easy to do while you've got the skid out. I'm going to do a video just on slider replacement on the snowmobile because my 670 I've got some new sliders for as well. But these sliders are really worn out. There's some really uneven wear here too. Now the one thing that I did notice with this machine was the track was on way too tight. So this one we're really going to make sure that it's aligned and tensioned properly. But yeah, if you're doing a track change, I'd really suggest you buy yourself a set of sliders. They're not that expensive and it's so much easier to get them off once the skid is out of the machine. So I'm just going to tap the old sliders off of there and then I can just push the new ones back into position and put the retaining screws in. All right, now don't be lazy here. While you're at this, take the time to lubricate your rear suspension as well. So if you give it a good going over, your manual may show you, but if not, just give it a good visual inspection. You'll find a number of grease fittings underneath your rear suspension, and you want to hit those with a good low temperature grease. All right, we're in the home stretch. Let's put the new track in under the machine and get ready to put the drive axle back in. Now we're basically just reversing the entire procedure, starting by reinstalling that drive axle. So you just roll it into the track and move it up front. So one thing you want to do when you're putting the drive axle in, you want to make sure the drive axle is right in tight against the track and that those cogs are fully engaged. Because if you have any excess track in the front, you can't get it right up into position. We're going to move that drive axle back into place, starting on the chain case side. We're just going to be really careful not to damage the oil seal. Then we'll reinstall that skid inside the track and get ready to bolt it back in. Okay, so once the track's in, the drive axle's in, the next thing we're just going to reverse that procedure. We're going to put the bolts in the front. That part wasn't too bad. It was a little bit of work to manhandle the skid back in. Getting the front bolts in wasn't bad. We had to push forward on the skid to line them up and put the bolts in. The rear bolt was a little bit tricky, so it was out maybe about an inch when we lowered the back end down. So we lowered it down till it was close, and then what we did, we took a ratcheting tie-down strap, and we just put it around the back part of the suspension here, just to compress it a little bit. And once we had it close, we just kind of cranked that strap tight until the bolts lined up and we popped the bolt back in. It wasn't that hard. Okay, next thing we do before we put the chain case back together, we're going to give it a really thorough clean. So we're starting fresh before we put the oil in. Going to use some brake cleaner. Going to clean the metal parts of the chain case. Be careful about getting brake cleaner on the rubber seal around the chain case because it can actually damage it. All right, so next off we want to reassemble our chain case. So we have our bearing and oil seal in here. We have the snap ring in to hold it in place. We have our little spacer that goes in there behind the bottom gear. And then we are going to put the chain on. So this is the same procedure that you follow for a chain case oil change. You're going to take the cover off, drain the old oil, inspect everything, clean it all, put it back together and refill it. When you reinstall the lower gear, make sure the shoulder goes to the inside. So we're going to get the teeth in place. A little bit of fussing around here to get this to line up with the splines on the drive axle. Okay, now we are going to reinstall the bolt that holds that lower gear in. So we're going to clean the threads on the bolt, going to put a little bit of Loctite on those threads. Then we're just going to snug that bolt up loosely and before we grab a torque wrench. So it's really important that you torque this lower bolt. So make sure you check your service manual for the torque specs.
When you're at your max.
Okay, the other question that comes up a lot is how tight to do the chain. So basically you're just going to do it hand tight. You're not going to crank on it. And then the one thing that you really want to make sure of is that you have it just tight enough that it doesn't touch the back of the chain case. Okay, so we're going to put about 8.5 ounces of synthetic chain case oil in here, and we're going to check it over the next day or two just to make sure that nothing's leaking. we're going to put that snap ring back on. We're going to put this cover back on this end and bolt it down. All right, with the speedometer cover reinstalled, there's a grease fitting on it. I'm going to go ahead and grease it with some synthetic suspension grease. All right, guys, so we're just about finished. I would say if I bought another snowmobile, I would do this procedure again, even if I didn't need a new track. And that might sound funny because it's a big job, but you know what? It was a great opportunity. So by dropping the rear skid, taking the clutch off, taking the chain case apart and the exhaust out, it was a great opportunity for me to get more familiar with this machine, for starters, which is going to be really nice going forward. But it was also a really good opportunity to inspect the machine and fix a bunch of little things I found. So, you know, the previous owner told me this machine had been serviced every year. I'd just say that the guy who serviced it had a different idea of maintenance than I do. So, I mean, the clutches were filthy. Obviously, there was the side of the tunnel was just caked with, you know, belt dust and oil. The chain case was disgusting. That oil hasn't been changed in a few seasons at least, let's be generous. You know, in terms of the rear suspension, the sliders were worn right out. I found an idler wheel that was pretty busted up, so I'm going to change that as well. Now, having said all that, overall, I'm still happy with the machine. Everything looks straight. I don't see anything that's broken. Nothing that really concerns me. It's all those little small maintenance items. So I'm really glad I had the opportunity to do that. And then when I start out riding with this sled, I know those things are done. These clutches are actually really dirty. In a future video, I'll take them apart and clean them properly. But for now, I'm just going to hit them with some XPS pulley and flange cleaner. Okay, next thing we're going to do is properly tension and align the track. And I've got another video on how to do that. I'll put a link to that video in the description for this one. Basically, we're just going to turn these adjuster bolts in until we get the track close to where we want it. And then we're going to keep making fine adjustments until we get it right. All right, once you got the track tension and alignment set with the rear end of the snowmobile up in the air, make sure you spin that track, start the machine up and spin that track a little bit, then check it again. Then we're going to run this sled and we're going to check it periodically. Probably in a couple 100 kilometers. It's going to stretch a little bit because it's brand new. We're going to have to check that tension again. All right, guys, so that's it. We have one last piece to install, the most critical piece, the hood emblem. All right, guys, that's it. We're done. We've installed the new Composite T32 track on the machine, and that's it. So even though I had a good place to work and a friend of mine with a lot more experience there to give me a hand if I needed it, I gotta say that wasn't as hard as I was expecting. Like most things, there's more than one way to do this job. I decided to start up front before I dropped the skid out and then finish taking the drive axle. You could just as easily have started by removing your rear skid and then turning your attention to the front of the sled. The one thing that I found really tough was getting this exhaust gas temperature sensor out. It was just in there so tight, it took a lot of effort to crank it out. And you have to take that sensor out in order to get your muffler out. Now, if any of you guys are more experienced, you've done a few of these track changes, you've got any tips or tricks that make any of this easier, as always, love to hear from you. Post something in the comments below. So I just haven't ridden this thing enough to give you a good review of the track. We're going to have to wait till we get a little bit more snow. But so far, just over from my friend's place, I'm really impressed. So the track ran really quiet, and even the fact that we don't have a ton of snow and we got a fair bit of ice on the road, I found the traction was really good. All right, so again, this is the T32 from Composit. If you want to find out a little bit more about why I chose this particular track, I did do another video, and I'll put a link to that in the description for this one. So far, I gotta say, I'm pretty impressed with what I see of the Composit product. Obviously, we have to get this sled out and do a lot more riding before I can give you a fair review. Still waiting for winter to really get rolling, but as soon as it does, I promise I will. All right, guys, that's it for me. If you liked that video, you found it entertaining or helpful, do me a favor and mash that thumbs up button, and then I'll keep doing more tutorials like this one. Until next time, I'm David Clark. Thanks for taking the time to watch. So once you get that speedometer out of the way, you can... So once you get that speedometer out... But like most things, it's only difficult until like... Oh, it's getting cold. So it's a big job. We got a fair bit of... So, and I'm saying that even given the fact that I came from a track that...